Borodar Pau, good morning everybody. This is your do now or Wanade now activity for today. There's 4 questions about your lesson yesterday on food chains and food webs. So pause the video here to answer these questions and then I'll go through the answers in a minute. Okay, so question 1, what is a producer? So a producer produces its own energy, in brackets food. For example, plants make energy via photosynthesis. Okay, so a producer produces its own energy or food, and the example we use is plants that make energy via photosynthesis. Question 2, what is a primary consumer and what type of feeder is it? So a primary consumer will eat the producer. Okay, and because the producer is usually a plant, we say that the type of feeder is a herbivore, which means it only eats plants. Number 3, what type of feeder is a secondary consumer? So we would say it is a carnivore because it eats meat, which means it eats other animals. Okay, so it eats the meat from other animals. So secondary consumers are carnivores. And number 4, what is always at the bottom bar of a pyramid of biomass or number? The answer to that one is a producer. So the producer is always the bottom bar. So give yourselves a mark out of 4 for this do now activity and we'll get started with today's lesson. So your title today is the Interdependency of Organisms. The learning objective is to understand how animals and plants are interdependent on each other for food, protection, shelter, etc. The keywords today are interdependent, pollination, plants and animals. So we'll start off at looking at interdependence between plants and animals. So both plants and animals depend on each other for food, shelter, protection and propagation. Plants produce food for both humans and animals who cannot make food by themselves. They also provide shelter and protection for wild populations. Plants also benefit from animals because animals can help to spread seeds and ensure plant sustainability in some areas. Animals such as bees will pollinate plants in the environment, which helps reproduction and survival of plants. So in the pictures we can see on this slide, we've got some horses that are eating grass, so they're using plants as food. And we've also got a lion that is camouflaging itself in the long grass that's the same colour as it, so it's using it for protection and shelter. Okay, so let's look at food, shelter and protection between plants and animals. So plants produce food for both humans and animals. They provide shelter and protection for populations such as bats, squirrels, insects, but also birds, things that live in trees like koalas in the picture here. There's a number of different animals that use different plants as shelter and protection from different predators and weathers. Plants and trees provide shade to a large amount of animals, so when it's very sunny, plants and trees can be used as protection from the sun by providing shade. Birds use trees to build nests high up away from predators. So we can see in that picture there is a bird nest with some eggs in. So that protects not only the adult birds but the eggs and the baby birds from predators. Plants absorb decayed soil material for their nutrients and are consumed by herbivore animals. Then carnivores eat the herbivores and the nutrition continues along the food chain. So we looked at this yesterday. The plant is the producer. Then the primary consumer will eat the producer. So I'll just put PC for primary consumer. Then we have a secondary consumer and a tertiary consumer and so on. So the primary consumer will eat the producer, the secondary consumer will eat the primary consumer, and so on. And the nutrients will pass through the different animals up the food chain. Some animals are prey to other animals called predators, and the prey will be hunted and eaten. Plants can provide shelter, protection and camouflage to the prey animals. Trees and bushes in forests are particularly useful for this. Animals compete with each other for food, territory and shelter. So you can see in the picture at the bottom we've got two animals with big antlers. They are having a fight, which means they would be competing for one of these things or a mate perhaps. Plants compete with each other for water, space, minerals and light. Forests are a particularly good ecosystem because they can also protect animals from extreme weather conditions. Okay, so review 1, adolygiad 1. There's 3 questions about plants and animals being interdependent and also forests as a beneficial ecosystem for this. So pause the video here to answer these 3 questions and then come back to the video and we'll go through them. Okay, so hopefully you've answered these 3 questions. I'll go through the answers now. Number 1, what is one way that animals are dependent on plants? So I'm actually going to write 2 ways down just in case you've got a different one. So I'm going to write down food. So plants are the start of the food chain. And also I'm going to say protection / shelter. So animals can use bushes, trees, grass for these things. So protection and shelter. So a lot of animals, like birds, use trees for shelter and protection. They put their nests high up in trees so that they are not in danger of being eaten. Number 2, what is one way plants are dependent on animals? So I'm going to put here pollination, and also I'll put a second one, seed dispersal. Okay, so that allows plants to survive. We'll look at those 2 things more a bit later on in the lesson. Number 3, how are forests beneficial for animals? So forests can protect animals from weather conditions. They can also provide protection, shelter, and camouflage. For animals. Okay, so forests are very good ecosystems for protection, shelter, and camouflage. So give yourselves a mark out of 3 for that one. I've put 2 different points for each one. So as long as you've got one of these for each one, then you can give yourself a mark. So once you've given yourself a mark, we can move on to the next part of the lesson. Now we're going to look at pollination and seed dispersal. So this is the way that plants are dependent on animals. So plants rely on animals for reproductive interdependence. For example, bees are major pollen carriers which are transferred between flowers, and that allows plants to reproduce. Bees will also obtain nectar of flowers as their nourishment. Pollination helps to reproduce certain kinds of plants, so bees are essential. Different animals aid the development of plants by carrying their seeds to different areas. It is essential for plants to grow over a sufficient area for their survival so that they don't have to compete for space, nutrients, and water to survive. So if there were a lot of plants in a small area, there would not be many resources, there would not be nutrients or space, they would all be fighting for water and enough sunlight, so the plants wouldn't be very good quality and they're more likely to die out. So it's really important for animals to carry the seeds around so that the plants can spread out over as much space as possible. Alright, now I want you guys to do review 2, Adolygiad die. There are 3 more questions. These ones are more about plants and how they have their pollen spread and their seed spread. So pause the video here to answer these 3 questions and we'll go over them in a second. Okay, so number 1, how are plants dependent on bees? So bees carry pollen between plants. Which allows reproduction. And this process is called pollination. So bees are essential for the pollination of plants, and a lot of species of plants would not be able to reproduce if it weren't for bees. So plants are very dependent on bees for pollination. Number 2, why is the spreading of seeds by animals so important for the survival of plants? So this is because seeds need to spread as far as possible so that plants don't compete for space, nutrients, water, etc. Okay, so animals have to spread the seeds so that plants don't have to compete for space, nutrients and water and stuff. That's really important because if plants had to compete for all those things in a very small space, they would not grow as much, they would not be as high quality, and they would probably die. So their survival is very dependent on seed dispersal by animals. Number 3, how would plants and animals depend on each other for food? Consider seed dispersal again when thinking about plants' food. Okay, so animals depend on plants because plants are producer of food chain. Okay, so all consumers need the first step of chain to be plants. Okay, so no matter what type of consumer it is, if it's a carnivore at the top of the food chain, it's still dependent on the plants being the producers, as they are always the first step in the food chain. So if the primary consumers can't eat the plants, then they won't have energy for animals higher up the food chain. So all animals are dependent on plants for food. And for plants being dependent on animals, we think back to our answer for question 2. So we said that it's important to spread the seeds so that plants grow in places where they don't have to compete. So plants need space and light to grow and make food. So seed dispersal is essential. Okay, so obviously plants need light to make their own food through photosynthesis, so they are dependent on animals to spread their seeds so that they can get an adequate amount of light to be able to make their food. So I hope you got an answer for all of these. If you got the answer wrong, don't worry, just write in what I've written. So give yourself a mark out of 3 for that, and we'll move on. Now we're going to look more at how plants make their food. So our sun provides radiation on the earth in the form of light. This sunlight is absorbed by plants. That's absorbed via the chloroplasts in the palisade cells in the leaves. So that's how plants absorb sunlight, and that allows them to create their own food through the process of photosynthesis. That's essential to the survival of all plants and animals in ecosystems, as plants producing their own food is the beginning of the food chains. Plants also need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, which is provided by animals respiring. This is a natural cycle, as photosynthesis produces oxygen, which is used by animals to respire. So in the picture at the top here, this is a good representation of this. So the cow is breathing out carbon dioxide, which is absorbed by the plant and used in photosynthesis. One of the waste products of photosynthesis is oxygen, so the plant will release that oxygen, and that's what all of the other animals use in respiration, which allows energy to be made in animals. So it's a cycle that repeats itself constantly. The animals will release carbon dioxide, which will be absorbed by the plants. The plants will release oxygen, which will be breathed in by the animals. Okay, now finally, the last part of this lesson, I would like you to do review 3 adolygiad tree. There's 3 more questions about plants and basically the last slide we looked at. So if you could pause the video here to answer these questions, and then I'll go through the answers in a minute. Alright, hopefully you've answered those 3 questions by now. Number 1, what process do plants use sunlight for? The answer is photosynthesis. And in brackets I'm going to put makes food. Okay, Number 2, how are plants dependent on animals in order to carry out this process? So this was a tricky question, and the answer is plants need carbon dioxide from animals to carry out photosynthesis. You could also have written about the seed dispersal thing that we looked at a bit earlier in the lesson. So plants need enough light for photosynthesis, which is dependent on space, and animals would need to disperse the seeds to give the plants enough space and light. So you could have written that as an answer, but this answer is what I was looking for. Plants need carbon dioxide from animals to carry out photosynthesis. Number 3 is the opposite. So how are animals dependent on plants in order to respire? So plants release oxygen, which animals breathe in and use for respiration. Okay, so give yourselves a mark out of 3 for review 3, and that's it for today's lesson. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next lesson. Bye!